It is my absolute pleasure to introduce John Caldwell, MFA, PhD, Distinguished Research Professor at the University of California, Los Angeles. He received the SCMS Distinguished Pedagogy Award in 2018 and has also received two NEA fellowships, a Bauhaus University Fellowship, and an Annenberg Senior Fellowship. His books include Specworld, Production Culture, Televisuality, New Media, Digitextual Theories, and Production Studies. His films have also premiered at the Margaret Mead Film Festival, Chicago International Film Festival, Documentary Film Festival Amsterdam, and the Sundance Film Festival, and have been broadcast in Australia and at PBS Chicago and Boston. A media retrospective of his award-winning films was recently exhibited by the UCLA Film and Television Archive at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Caldwell. We're so excited for your presentation.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. The presentations this morning were incredibly helpful for me, and I appreciate being a part of this conversation. I'd like to add to the crucial roles that unions and organized labor play in the arts by talking about two seldom emphasized realities in the discussion. The first is the role of non-union labor. Film and media production are mixed work economies. And the second is the problematic role that the arts and film higher education play in greasing the skids toward precarity in ways that make unpaid aspirational work and underpaid early career labor seem normal and legitimate. I'd like to get my PowerPoint going here if I could. Anyway, stresses in production make career longevity almost difficult, if not unsustainable, for most creators. As a career educator in both arts and film schools, I have been troubled by the long odds and human predicament faced by anyone who wants to create on-screen media. I began my book Production Culture in 2008 when I found companies that had to give their overworked 25 to 35-year-old VFX workers mid-career sabbaticals in the late 1990s just to mentally survive what they termed their workstation masters and 24/7 digital sweatshops. Years later, I started my most recent book, Specworld, after viewing scores of online down in flames, quitting my channel videos by angry teen and post-adolescent makers who raged that their giant platform host had cruelly demonetized them, preventing them from having profitable careers in production. If you could go to the next slide, that would be great. Several management tactics in film and media fuel and normalize gig work precarity. These include inordinately long employment periods as personal assistants, the use of unpaid interns for necessary work, endless outsourcing to cheaper offshore firms, preaching pay your dues rationales to salve long-suffering and poorly paid underlings, and invisible credit for many anonymous contract workers. The industry, if you could go to the next slide, please. The industry does not just extract surplus economic value from creative workers in these ways. It also legitimizes its taking by promoting a range of how to make it mythologies. I've tried to make sense of various schemes that industry uses to normalize its appropriation. These include fake script contests, entrant-funded film festivals, pitch fests led by mid and low-level experts who aren't, co-branding merchandising opportunities, showrunner absent writers' rooms, and endless oversupply of unqualified wannabe agents, reps, managers, and intermediaries. All of these industrial cultural schemes make draining money from the independent creator community and underemployed professionals seem normal, productive, and to be expected. During the pandemic, tens of thousands of contract employees, non-union and work for hire crew left the U.S. And were unable, who didn't left the U.S. were unable to get federal CARES or payroll protection subsidies because the IRS considered them neither employees nor corporations. If you could go to the next slide. Of course, Hollywood created that very identity confusion, employee versus single self-employed contractor, many decades ago. By treating many contract workers outside of IATSE contracts as self-employed freelancer, Hollywood jettisoned any responsibility for providing medical or retirement benefits or longer-term security. In many ways, post-war Hollywood had arguably invented the gig economy, which became its production prototype or addiction long before Uber and Lyft upscaled and platformed gigging. LA's large, flexible, always at the ready workforce, essentially on-call flex labor, proved itself to studios and independent producers as a lean overhead labor cash cow. Hollywood took that mixed labor arrangement to the bank for more than a half a century, and both sides, labor and management, made money during those decades of stability. However, pandemic, AI, onset virtual production, and other things spur lots of proposals now for smaller crews, smaller location footprints, and reduced interworker interaction on the set. These moves threaten workflows and collective but narrow craft specialization that still holds in unionized A-list production. The executive impulse to switch to lower cost indie mode to reboot Hollywood fits a long history of opportunism that seldom hesitated to add de-skilling and multitasking pressures onto workers whenever possible. Next slide, please. Spec work, my focus today and in much of this recent book, can be defined simply as expressive media work undertaken freely to increase the odds that the expressor or spec artist will score some greater or more profitable career goal in the future. Next slide. Studying creative speculation may make sense partly because we already have a long history of focusing on the concepts involved: expression, creativity, foresight, personal vision, and innovation. Arts and humanities scholars are well-versed in researching the artifacts of spec work: sketches, inspiring incidents, first drafts, storyboards, test scenes that point to or somehow prove those personality-based philosophical ideals. Scholars have long sought vision in productions upstream. This was traditionally called development and pre-production. Next slide, please. Screenwriters have known a fairly benign form of this term for decades: the spec script. On-spec in television jargon meant writing and submitting entire teleplays as calling cards intended to win over executives or producers, even though spec scripts were never intended or expected to go into production or generate near-term revenues. The real goal of the TV spec script: to show producers and executives that writers seeking work have the chops and skills to write professionally, but on some show, series, film, or project of the studio or network other than the one listed in the title of the spec script. In television trade logic, spec scripts are working samples that open doors and get potential partners to start brainstorming imagined narratives, series, or relationships. Thank you. Consider some of the other examples from my fieldwork of mainstream spec work. A filmmaker asked the crew on a low-budget, no-budget feature production to bring their own gear in exchange for points from distribution income. The newcomer director implicitly pays his more experienced AC, recordist, and gaffer with greater license to fill gaps in stylized scenes. The film gets a festival release, no crew member gets actual distribution income, but the director leverages his improv first feature as calling card to raise real money for his second film. Another example: with the new Red digital camera and file-based recording, a director during the film to digital transition vastly overshoots each scene for a primetime episode. Unable to view all the dailies owing to his excessive shooting ratio, the director depends on his or her editor to pull the best takes, but there aren't even enough hours in the post-production week for the editor to even view all the footage from the overshooting. This forces the editor, in turn, to defer to lowly assistant editors, minimum wage loggers, and undermotivated PAs to informally pre-select, that is, pre-imagine the eventual narrative world just to meet deadlines. The final screen content cobbled together in part from pre-story fatigue culling by a chain of assistants. But it's not just underlings. The book has an extended discussion of a costume designer that spent 80 hours and a lot of personal money up front in order to score a job in an extended pitch session with a feature film director that ended up including two other union professionals and other crafts who came on board to help create at least a half dozen different pre-production artifacts that took considerable amount of work and investment. Next slide, please. In fact, even pros now give it away for free, hoping to stiff intense competition and to win new work. Their own guaranteed guild rates be damned. Next slide, please. Professionals who do this often defend it due to heightened barriers to entry. To succeed, that is, you can't just verbally pitch a new show idea to an executive anymore. You are pressured to present additional prototyping materials, tape or video of sample scenes or a beta-tested web series to demonstrate, dramatize, or pre-enact your proposed production. And of course, all of these ancillary media forms must be self-financed by the spec worker. Much of moving image production actually takes place well before the director calls action on any first day of a shoot. Next slide, please. There's a whole industry that I study, a production industry that simply produces things for other aspiring workers in the production industry to make it in Hollywood. That's the spec industry I'm talking about here. And here's an example of the kind of things aspiring, rising, and younger workers have to pay for in order to just be in the ballgame. Next slide, please. Interestingly, we once thought of all the imaginative spec behaviors I've just outlined as not unlike art or art making. Speculative creation has been long seen as a voluntary predicament chosen and willingly adopted by often self-marginalized art makers. The difference now, however, is that this repertoire of preemptive gifting behavior is normalized inside immense proprietary technical platforms that efficiently monetize all of that artistic speculation and creative expression in veiled ways that are unknown to the expressor. Next slide, please. Next slide. Why do workers amplify their artistry in this shadow industry and countless sub-firms in Hollywood? As the availability of creative work drops and precarity increases, the symbolism and talk about creative work increases. After all, workers with job security have little need to justify or constantly theorize in public about what they are doing and why, or to claim that they are artists or authors. Yet underemployed workers and unemployed aspirants are stuck with the unenviable task of constantly convincing others about how and why they are artists, why their skills are exceptional even though they are not working, why they bring creative distinction and deserve employment. Without actual work, that is, the well-oiled shadow industry stimulates for a fee the vast aspirant pool to master rhetorical justifications, imaginary productions, and personal authorial brands. More than just crude hustling and self-promotion, vocational artistic self-crediting lies at the heart of this now obligatory rule that everyone in production should develop a signature vision and a personal brand. Next slide, please. Aspirants and the underemployed struggle in these ways to assign themselves credit and make it out of Hollywood's shadow industry into the real industry. Yet even successful, overworked professionals must now increasingly leverage cultural capital by creating spec work. Next slide, please. For the industry, elaborate symbolic payroll systems sustain the considerable amounts of spec labor that result. This symbolic pay includes all sorts of soft capital with which aspirants and the underemployed are actually paid. Buzz, credits, festivals, brand affiliation, creative visibility, or subsidized by them, crew bartering, student loans, university credit, spousal support, parents, trust funds, paying one's dues, sacrifice, and day jobs. Every production leverages massive amounts of this collective symbolic soft capital, which is never accounted for in studio line item budgets. If symbolic capital props up Specworld, stress aesthetic rationalizing provides a consent that normalizes this industrial labor gifting swamp. The cultural rationales that industry uses to justify the long hours, stressful conditions, and precarity of its underemployed, flexible workforce. These include attributions of quality out of struggle, creativity in the face of duress, and profitability from intense collective teamwork. Such tropes regularly surface and against all odds in Genesis myths, in below-the-line trades, in union roundtables, and in competitive craft bake-offs and technical reveals. Next slide, please. The sobering economic disparities in stressed physical production can be intense and exhausting. Art, by contrast, can soothe the frictions between embedded production interests. Media art talk provides soft, slippery, and malleable discourse to buffer, normalize those deprivations. The question should not be who is sticking it to the workers with these aesthetic lies about deprivation as a badge of honor, nor is it either or. Are the aspiring media makers and the unpaid interns using Disney to get ahead in their careers, or being used by the cold conglomerate to increase Disney profit margins? Trying to nail down a single definitive culprit, the stressed, precarious labor system, is less useful than calling out the odd coalition of interests that together sustain stressed labor arrangements. Next slide, please. I researched why we as cultural and creative workers voluntarily defer to and participate in today's gig economies. Answering this means taking serious the symbolic economy that pays creative labor for its pain in something other than cash. Next slide, please. Because I wasted time not getting into this thing sooner, I'm going to jump ahead. If you could go a couple slides, okay, to this. Actually, could you go back? Okay, so the first, what I've talked about so far is a kind of aesthetic scheme and a way of thinking that comes out of traditional art and film schools. Most of my ethnographic research has been with a younger generation of aspiring creators in the online space, and this included several years of participant observation at VidCon and other spaces for up-and-coming creators and influencers, where they are taught this thing. They have to pay a lot of money to take workshops to tell them to be a success in industry, you have to kill off film aesthetics and anything that might be taught in a real film school. Next slide, please. Everybody is told you can't just write a script. You have to produce video productions to illustrate it before you go in and take meetings. Next slide, please. The goal is to flood these digital platforms with lots of content. The algorithm is basically the master. Next slide. And again, these are expensive workshops by quote unquote experts in content creation who tell you things like this. Your goal is to collapse the creator workflow into a multitasking singularity, script, shoot, edit, share, all at the same time, which is an absurd kind of proposition if you've ever been in production. Next slide. Principles like this, production planning, preparation, and screen quality can derail career success. Next slide. And in these environments, a whole generation of adolescent and post-adolescent online creators are being told to lead with your IP and publish in public. Don't worry, we'll manage and tier it later. So next slide, please. What's the downside of all of this? This kind of pressure, both from traditional art school mythologies, film school mythologies, that you're paid for with the kind of suffering and that comes with personal vision on the one hand, and the online pre-film school that I've just raced through talking about there, both, I think, prevent and work against the kind of production mentoring that's needed to move into traditional incremental craft work. Next slide, please. Labor is a missing category in the online creator rhetoric that makes up the pre-film school online. Its alternative quasi-MBA entrepreneurialism rules and dominates even individual creator trade talk for adolescents. This scheme undercuts both labor and collective action as viable options. The platforms favor instead the creator's self posing as a speculative brand, startup, or IPO. The Holy Grail, waiting intensely for the hidden algorithm to discover and monetize the creator's manic content uploads is your goal. Next slide, please. And next slide, I'll move ahead here. Rising YouTube creators attempted to regain a foothold of control in 2016. Key creators launched an Internet Creators Guild invoking the DGA, yet demanded none of the conditions that unions demand by definition. The ICG functioned more like a wishful chamber of commerce than a collective bargaining unit that manages labor expertise through scarcity. As ever more failed YouTubers uploaded giving up videos into a platform genre, the ICG itself gave up and closed down in 2019. Next slide. Here's some of the examples of that. Next slide. Next, please. Aspiring filmmakers must now master and pay for preemptive ancillary spec work much earlier to add to their brand and build career arcs in production. This creator feeder supply now dwarfs in size and intensity the much smaller demographic worlds that once fed film school with applicants. No longer just aspiring untrained applicants for entry, adolescent creators now constitute a very real and robust pre-college aspirant hive economy. As with the traditional value-adding chain for postgraduate indie filmmakers a decade or two ago, online adolescent creators must now be well-versed and trained explicitly in production and management of symbolic capital. Yet they must master it at a younger age. Undertaking these tasks, front-loading adolescents with administrative and development tasks in production, feeds the larger industry with vast amounts of cheap starter content, crazy ideas, pilots, and demos. At the same time, it showcases endless candidates for viable IP. Aspirant creators act more conscious at an earlier age of media making as a bureaucratic, speculative enterprise. Next slide, please. Okay. Looking back, it seems like one thing to ask how career-threatening pressures trapped 20 and 30-something creative pros in the 90s and early 20th century. It feels like an entirely different matter for me to discern how and why aspiring 21st century adolescent creators in the social media sharing era would rail against similar stress-inducing, career-ending midlife precarities as teenagers. Over the years in academia, I responded to the dark prospects for both generations by trying to rebalance our curriculums listing ship. Several missing areas I argued might better serve and equip our creator students Next slide, please. For the industries that they would actually enter. In particular, we needed to add courses, especially for artists and film auteurs, that covered intellectual property history, production and creative labor history, media law, and political economic analysis of the media. None of those things were taught in the MFA program that I was in at Cal Arts because we were focused on cinema, aesthetics, and personal vision. Since then, at UCLA, I've tried to help develop a curriculum in the film school that addresses these other issues that I think artists need to think about sooner rather than later. These perspectives could actually bolster media art making, I reason, even as electives to the core production curriculum, which traditionally emphasize form, narrative structure, technical practice, and aesthetics. In fact, I argued those questions should be inseparable from aesthetics. Next slide, please. And in the interest of time, since I lost so much at the start there, I'm going to jump ahead to the end here in the last few pages. Next slide. Next slide. Finally, I must qualify my arguments today with some caveats. Clearly, artists have always had to find day jobs, always had to market themselves to patrons, dealers, festivals, distributors. Those artists and filmmakers who did not market themselves effectively enough failed or disappeared from the art scene. Yet the self-marketing normalized today, a 24/7 phenomenon with ever-moving benchmarks for success, makes autonomous paid individual creation even more difficult to pull off. Next slide. Finally, I must qualify. We fall into line in production. We partner with sketchy producers and sub-firms despite our experience with bad behavior. We disregard inequity in the workplace or on the set, not just because producers and executives pay us to disregard those things. Our well-scripted philosophies of art and craft also feed into our compliance as workers. We normalize the system in the ways we self-justify, precarious creative labor as a worthy pursuit. Aspirational media makers rationalize their stress to showcase their potential creativity. Today, I've tried to call out complicity, including my own as an educator, in both art schools and film schools in sanctioning two dubious aesthetic workarounds, two forms of conceptual misdirection that help erase labor and wages as categories. Specifically, production built around singular artistic vision from traditional art schools and film schools, and production treated as an entrepreneurial stock option from the new online pre-film school of adolescent creators and influencers. Both undercut collective identity and agency. Both normalize the gig economy precarity that fuels creative work now. Both ideologies keep us from treating media arts creation as work or as collective human action. The ways we are trained, rationalize, and think about creative work, not just the creative work itself, matters. Thank you.